Okay, good evening, everybody. I can't see you, but I certainly hope that you can see me. My name is Nicholas Saul. I'm the Director for Arts and Humanities at the IAS. Some of you will know me, some of you won't. It's lovely to meet you all, seen or unseen, this evening. It's a delight also to welcome Professor Sowon Park, our joint fellow with the Institute of Medical Humanities on the Threshold World's Dream project, to the IAS for her lecture this evening. Just a couple of words on her background for those who may not know her. Professor Park studied for her DPhil at Oxford and currently professes English literature, literary theory, and cognitive literary studies at the University of California at Santa Barbara. Already in her career, she's worked at Oxford, Cambridge, and Seoul, and held visiting appointments at San Diego and the Leibniz Center for Literary Studies in Berlin. And she's led several major research groups on themes such as unconscious memory and sustainability and the new human. But her talk this evening links all that with another of her specialisms, comparative literature. I suppose we're all familiar with the cliche that today's world, at least in economic terms, has become globalized. But what about other dimensions of globalization, such as culture, and more narrowly, literature? In one of my specialisms, which is the thing that used to be called German literature, we now find texts written in German by writers who were born in Germany, but born in Germany of immigrant stock, and identify as both Turkish and German, or Japanese and German, or Syrian and German, or neither, something else altogether. So who are they writing for? Scholars are having to invent whole new intercultural categories and concepts to frame their meanings. On another level, the global literary market has in the last 2 centuries opened up national markets to literature from everywhere, usually in translation. This ought to catalyze intercultural understanding, but, asks Professor Park, does it really? On this problem, as we're about to see and hear, she brings an entirely novel perspective to bear. And with that, over to her for world literature, some old and new ideas.
Hello, I am Sowon Park, and this is my IAS lecture on world literature. I'm very sorry not to be there in person with you, and I'd like to thank the Institute of Advanced Study for inviting me. And but here I am, still in California, alone in my study, delivering this lecture, trying to not think this is too mad, because I'm kind of effectively talking to myself, but I will do my best and see how it goes. So share screen, and here we are. So today I am going to be talking about world literature, some old and new ideas. So if we think about world literature, we can think of it as kind of the best that's been thought and said in the world. They're so good they transcended their local time and place to become, to assume a place of universality. That's what we think very basically when we think about world literature. They're so good that they've become universal. But what counts as best can differ enormously depending on who's doing the reading. So there are many, many different concepts of what world literature is and what it should be and what it shouldn't be. But in practice, it has traditionally meant, world literature has traditionally meant literatures from the 5 major European states: England, Spain, France, Germany, and Italy, and Russia and USA. So that has traditionally, empirically referred to the whole world literary canon has meant literatures of these states. So which conflicts with the ideal of world literature, which is the best that's been thought and said in the world. Many people have found this very deeply problematic, and some of the thoughts that I'm sharing with you today emerges from the work that I did with my colleague Yone Hapyan on the Oxford bibliographies, where we annotated 200 plus really key texts in the field of world literature and the great debates in this field from the 19th century to the present. And you can think of world literature as a political ideal or an aesthetic ideal and so on and so forth. But on very basic terms, it's the best that's been thought and said. The key issue is what's best. Out of all these various ideas about what world literature is, this is a quote that illustrates one of the key ideas which I'd like to develop in this lecture. And this is from Capital in the 21st Century by Thomas Piketty. And I'll read this quote. The novels of Jane Austen and Honoré de Balzac paint striking portraits of the distribution of wealth in Britain and France between 1790 and 1830. Both novelists were intimately acquainted with the hierarchy of wealth in their respective societies. They grasped the hidden contours of wealth and its inevitable implications for the lives of men and women, including their marital strategies and personal hopes and disappointments. These and other novelists depicted the effects of inequality with a verisimilitude and evocative power that no statistical or theoretical analysis can match. Indeed, the distribution of wealth is too important an issue to be left to economists, sociologists, historians, and philosophers. So here, captured in this quote, is the idea that literature provides a knowledge of the general movement of history with the particularity of individuals who lived through the history. So Piketty is presenting a view of literature as a mode of knowledge which captures the wide sweep of history as well as the lived experience of individuals. So it's a particular mode of knowledge which is different from economics or philosophy or mathematics or physics. It's a very specific mode of knowledge which is worth our investigation for this reason, because it provides a generality as well as the particularity of history. Now, Piketty's section is the latest, one of the latest in a long line of thoughts about what literature is, and you can see this in a letter by Engels in 1888. So he's writing to Margaret Harkness, and he says, this is Engels, that he learned more about French society and history from Balzac than from all the professed historians, economists, and statisticians of the period together. Again, we from this section, we hear the view of literature as a special mode of knowledge which pulls together different kinds, aspects of human life. Now, Engels and Marx predicted that world literature will be the next stage in literary form of human history, and that world literature will be inevitable as national literatures decline. And they're talking about globalization in this context. This is from the Communist Manifesto, 1848. And the kind of literary form that was predicted by Marx and Engels has actually materialized today. And this is world literature, or globalized literature in the 21st century. And here you see Haruki Murakami, Pamuk, Hangang the Vegetarian, and even books like J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter. What do they have in common? Well, these novelists and many others are now writing for an international community of readers, and not necessarily for their own local linguistic and cultural community. In the words of Rebecca Walkowitz, these are born translated novelists, i.e., they are writing with a view to having their works translated into English. Well, not those already writing in English, but the non-English writers are writing their novels with a view to it being translated into English, so they won't use reference points that are untranslatable, idioms that are untranslatable, even place names or allusions. These will be English friendly. So we have now a trend where world literature is considered to be literature in translation, i.e. translated into English for the global market. And in many ways, this is something to be greatly celebrated because all these diverse literatures are translated into English, we now have access to all these traditions that we wouldn't have had before. So world literature in the 21st century is heavily associated with the ideal of cultural diversity and preservation of cultural diversity all around the world. So, for example, the BBC's dramatization of Nigerian novels, which is ongoing at this point, is celebrated in this context that we are celebrating the different traditions of the world. But not everybody is so celebrated because there is a question mark hovering around world literature, which is literature in translation and diversity. Because is it that diverse is the question. Because if one is already always writing for a foreign international English-speaking audience, doesn't that preclude real diversity? And so Masao Miyoshi has said of Murakami's work, Murakami writes not of Japan, but what the foreign book buyers like to see in it. And there's a great deal of debate on this. So the question I would like to pose is world literature, as it is currently defined, i.e. literature and translation, the English global market, and so on and so forth, actually more diverse than national literature, which is the assumption. The assumption is that national literatures are always parochial and insular, nationalist, and so on and so forth, and world literature is cosmopolitan, transnational, embracing of diversity, and so on and so forth. I think the picture is a lot more complicated than this for the reasons I will outline. And a very prominent critic of the trend that world literature is heading towards is Tim Parks, whose widely read essay, The Dull New Global Novel. In the essay, it was a trenchant critique, he says this: what seems doomed to disappear, or at least to risk neglect, is the kind of work that revels in the subtle nuances of its own language and literary culture. The sort of writing that can savage or celebrate the way this or that linguistic group really lives. In the global literary market, there will be no place for any Barbara Pyms and Natalia Ginsbergs. Shakespeare would have eased off the puns. A new Jane Austen can forget the Nobel. He calls this the dull new global novel, which we can put in comparison with the born translated novel, which is kind of the more celebratory novel or celebrated version of this novel. So if we think back to the idea I proposed at the beginning that was captured by Piketty and Engels, if we think of world literature as a mode of knowledge about human history, which captures the general movement of history with the particularity of the individuals who live through it, how might cultural diversity be brought through in this context? So to think through this issue, I turn to two contemporary Korean novelists. One is widely read by the international community. The second, I think, to my knowledge, completely unknown. So it's Hangang and Kwon Yeson. Kwon Yeson's Pombam, Spring Night has actually been translated into English, but it's a work that really resists translation for the reasons I will point out. So Hangang's a vegetarian. This is the opening sentence, which goes, Before my wife turned vegetarian, I'd always thought of her as completely unremarkable in every way. Now, in this sentence, there's almost no foreign aspect that you can detect in this sentence. It is already an English sentence in terms of idiom or construction or references or even vocabulary. There's nothing non-English about this opening sentence of the vegetarian. If you read this sentence in Korean, one would think that one wouldn't naturally think, wow, this is a Korean novel, because the word vegetarian already sounds like an imported concept. 해식주의자 is not a kind of bottom-up, grass level Korean concept at all. It's as a political concept, vegetarianism, it is a concept that was imported from the West. So already there is kind of a free-floating internationalist, non-culture specific aspect of the tone in which she writes, which is probably one of the reasons why this novel is so widely loved around the world. This is not to diminish the remarkable success of The Vegetarian in any way. I'm just noting the differences between this novel, which is contemporaneous with this short story, Spring Night by Kwon Yeon, which really doesn't translate into English. So the opening sentence is this: life is an awful business, isn't it? Now, this is a terrible sentence, because who speaks like this? Life is an awful business, isn't it? We don't really get a sense of who's speaking or who the person is speaking to. We don't really get a sense of the relationship between them. We don't really get anything. But if we read this in Korean, 산다는 게 참 끔찍하다. 그렇지 않니? You already know that the speaker, the addresser and the addressee, they're in a very intimate relationship because they're not using honorifics. The word 끔찍 is kind of an untranslatable word because it's so heavily grounded in the Korean experience. All of these things are fully erased when you translate it into English. And so from this, you can infer Kwon Yeon did not have an international reading audience in mind when she wrote it. She was reading this for her own linguistic community. And in fact, the entire short story is heavily intertextual with other Korean texts that came before. So all of which is completely erased when you translate it to English. It just becomes an odd piece of work, which sits very oddly. So in the paradigm of the new global novel, what else gets erased and why does it matter? I would like to, in addition to the many things that other people have brought to the discussion, I would like to propose the neglected issue of writing or script as the thing that gets distorted in our understanding of world literature and why it matters. Why does writing matter in world literature discussions? Because when we say that a novel has been translated from Finnish or Japanese or Spanish, it never states what the written language was. So the assumption here is that spoken language and written language are the same thing. And this makes sense in Europe because since at least the Renaissance, the Roman alphabet has been the standard in European literary cultures. So you don't have to say it was written in the Roman alphabet because it's always written in the Roman alphabet. So English is the spoken language of England, and we don't say the written language is the Roman alphabet. But outside of Europe, this is not the case. The fact that spoken language and written language are not differentiated, this tradition comes from European philology, where the concept of a language is based on speech, is based on spoken language. This is very, very Europe-specific. So, for example, when you say this poem was translated from the Korean, this is very mystifying because there is no such thing as a Korean written language. it's just a made-up concept that doesn't exist. Korean, written Korean can be 향찰, as you can see, or it can be 이두, or it can be 구결, or it can be Hangul, the Korean alphabet, which is the standardized norm now, but it wasn't until the middle of the 20th century, or it can be in Hanmun Chinese, which was the standard until relatively recently, historically speaking. So this document is the Korean Declaration of Independence, 1919, and 98% of it is written, 95% of it is written in Chinese. So the idea that Korean alphabetic writing captures the essence of the Korean spirit is a very, very recent idea. As you can see, 1919, like 100 years ago, even the Korean Declaration of Independence was written in Chinese. Now, because Korea and many cultures around the world are digraphic, i.e. they use more than one writing systems to write, there's a great variety of mixed script writing, which doesn't really exist in European countries or European traditions. So I think most people can read this word, and they'll probably read it as soul, because E-O-U-L-U-L is written in the Roman alphabet. The first S, the first letter, is written in the Korean alphabet. This is kind of mixed script writing, which is very, very common and very popular, and it captures kind of the exuberance, playfulness of digraphic cultures, that you mix writing systems, you mix languages to communicate that very specific intersection of lived experience in that time and space. So another example of what it's like to live in a digraphic culture, this is an underground sign of Apgujeong stop, K212, and it's written in 3 scripts. Apgujeong Rodeo, the big writing is Korean alphabet, and then you've got the Roman alphabet, Apgujeong Rodeo, and then you've got mixed script writing, Apgujeong written in Chinese and Rodeo written in Hangul. All Koreans can write their names in 3 scripts, Roman alphabet, Hangul, and Hanmun. And you see this in popular culture where people mix scripts. So 21 is a name of a band, and they write their names like this. G Dragon is an artist, a band member of a group called Big Bang. And why is he called G Dragon? Because his name is Chiyong. So he writes his name G Dragon because Yong is the Korean word for dragon. So this is, again, the kind of mixed script, interlingual playfulness captured in popular culture. So if I were to write my own name, I can write in 3 ways. One is in the Roman alphabet, with this within the brackets, Sowon, S-O-W-O-N. I can write it in Hangul, Sowon. I can write it in Chinese, Sowon. I can always mix it up and write Sowon, which some people do. This is from Go Go, a song by a K-pop band called BTS. And you can see it's in 2 scripts, in English and, well, 2 languages, English and Korean, but it's also written in 2 scripts, the Roman alphabet and Korean Hangul. So, $, 하루아침에 전부 탕진, 달려, 내가 벌어 내가 샀지. So they're punning the English word $, with 달려, which means run, to capture the frenetic consumerism of modern life, where people are running and spending money. And so, you know, go is this is part of the song Go Go, which is very, very typical of all K-pop lyrics, that it'll be interlingual, it'll be in mixed script. And there's a creative fusion of energy here by mixing the languages, which is often how people actually talk. This is how people actually live. So outside of the European norm, where you have standardized national languages, so in England you speak English, there's no mention of what writing system that they're using. The relations between spoken language and written language is a lot more interesting than this European model. So for 6,500 spoken languages around the world, there are hundreds of scripts, and the relations between them are immensely complicated and rich. So once we get step outside the phonocentric bias that comes from the European model, we open our view to a much wider field of world literature. So when we talk about Indian literature, it could be written in English, but it could be written in Hindi, it could be written in Gujarati, it could be written in Bengali, it could be written in Kannada, it can be written in Tamil. And of course, many people actually mix languages and mix scripts. So the complex relations between speech and text outside of Europe is something that the field of world literature, we have to open our eyes to and to celebrate if we are going to talk about real diversity. So for example, when we talk about Nigeria, there is no one Nigerian language. Nigeria, I believe, has over 500 spoken languages. Papua New Guinea has over 800 spoken languages. India has 22 official spoken languages, and there are at least 121 languages spoken by 10,000 people or more. So the linguistic diversity of the world and the complex relations between the spoken language and the written language and the combination is something that that is completely erased from world literary history as it is understood now. So the question I have to put to you again is a literature written in a national language the sovereign expression of a particular worldview? So the idea, a very common idea in world literature is the idea that if you just have one, Nigerian literature, we have Mongolian literature, Finnish literature, Spanish literature, and we have all these diverse categories, then it's kind of world literature in its full glory. But I think the very fact that literature is kind of pigeonholed into a national language, it distorts the entire history of how literatures were written within that cultural tradition, because of course nation states is a relatively recent invention. And if you think about mapping world literature according to national categories, what we're doing is we're only reproducing 19th century imperialist cartography, because all these nation states were created by European nations, or but by the lens of European languages imposed onto these traditions around the world, erasing all the complex relations that existed between languages until that point. So the idea that there is a language and that written language is the transcription of speech of a national language is a European alphabetic bias, which needs to be corrected if we are going to really celebrate the diversity of the literary traditions that have existed around the world. Now, how do we do this? This is not so easy if one comes from the European tradition, where you have the Roman alphabet is the only writing system that exists. So from this point onwards, I'm going to try and give you enough examples so that everybody can get a sense of why different writing systems matter and how we can actually appreciate different literary cultures with different writing systems. So the two main differences between writing systems around the world, and I'm being very, very general here, might be what we might call speech writing, and the other something that we might call idea writing. So speech writing is phonocentric, i.e. it's the writing that captures the sound of speech. So it might be phonetic, it might be phonemic, it might be phonographic, it might be alphabetic. So I'll put that in one category. The other category, and of course they overlap to a certain extent, would be communicating through vision. So it would be visual symbols with speech overlaid on top of it. So this you might call logographic writing, morphemic writing, ideographic writing, morphogrammic writing, or semantographic writing, and so on and so forth. So I am trying to build brush two very, very broad pictures so as to compare the two, because the logographic or ideographic is completely hidden from view in our current conceptions of what world literature is. Now, this is something that I get asked a lot, so I'll just touch upon it very, very briefly, the difference between what we call ideographs and what we call logographs. So just very, very broadly, ideographs are symbols that represent ideas. Logographs are symbols that represent full words. So if you look at the Chinese equivalent, you can see the tree, the symbol, the character for tree. It can be an idea. It can also be the word for tree. But if you get to the forest, which is made of 3 trees, that's already a word. And because this is so complex, I'll try to really bring home the difference through by telling you a story of a historical encounter between a Jesuit missionary and a Korean astronomer who met in 18th century Beijing. And the Jesuit was Ferdinand Augustin Haller von Hallerstein, and he was the head of the Imperial Board of Astronomy and Mathematics of the Qing dynasty. He came from a region which is now Slovenia, and he met with an astronomer philosopher called Tamhon Hongdaeong. Hongdaeong is his name, Tamhon is his pen name, and this is the only portrait of Hong that exists, which was painted by his friend Song when he was actually in Beijing as part of the Korean mission. He was there for 60 days. It was the Joseon Imperial to Beijing, which was then called Yanjing. It's called Joseon Yeonhaengsa, and these are 2 lovely pictures we have of the mission. And Hong and Hallerstein met 3 times in the South Catholic Church in Beijing. And the picture at the top is of the church as it looked then, and the one at the bottom is a more recent picture. And Hongdaeong wrote of their encounter in his travelogue called Tamon Yenjing Records, Tamon Yonggi, which was written in classical Chinese. And this is one of the 3 finest pre-modern Korean travelogues that exist. And it's kept in the Cheonan Hongdaeong Science Museum, which is a couple of hours south of Seoul, which is a wonderful museum. And the book is kept there. This is a picture I took of the Tamon Yenjing Records. And the bit that I want to discuss is the conversation they have about writing. They talk about astronomy, music, lots of things, but this is a section on writing. And at one point, Hongdaeong, and I should mention here, they couldn't talk to each other, so they did what was a very common thing in the region at the time, which is called brush conversation. So they wrote in Chinese and conversed that way. And at one point, Tamon Hongdaeong asks Hallerstein, do Europeans use Chinese characters to write? And the assumption here is it's extraordinary that he could have even asked this question, because now Chinese writing is so specific to the Chinese culture that the idea that written Chinese could have traveled all the way and become a universal language is quite extraordinary. But Hallerstein's answer gives us a sense of how people understood writing systems at that time, which is not how we understand it today, because Hallerstein's answer says, no, in Europe, we only use speech writing. So speech writing, onja, are the 2 letters that's indicated by the yellow arrow. In Europe, we only use speech writing, i.e. we only use the alphabet. So from this, that we can understand that there was a common understanding of the alphabet, but also a different kind of writing, which they call idea writing. So how does idea writing work is the question that you might have in your minds. Idea writing was the common writing which unified this Chinese script world, as it were, which is a region that extends in China, Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. Korea, Japan, Vietnam, and China, they're all very separate languages, but they all use the same writing systems to write, which baffles many people, because they think, if it's not the sound of speech, how does that writing system work? So the 2 characters in the orange box, hanja, means Chinese. So the first character means Chinese or Han. The second character means character or writing or letters. If I were a Mandarin speaker, I would read that as hanzi. If I were Japanese, it would be pronounced as kanji. Because I'm Korean, I read that as hanja. If I were Vietnamese, I would say hantu. So the same visual symbols will be read differently according to the spoken language of the speaker, but the meaning remains consistent. So I'll give you a few other examples of how this might work. So if you look at numbers, that you can see 3 symbols, 1, 2, and 3. The symbols 1, 2, and 3 communicate visually. I can just read them out loud as 1, 2, 3. The meaning is the same. I can read them out loud as 1, 2, 3, which would be the Korean way of talking it. But the visual symbol and the meaning of the visual symbol will remain constant whether I'm an English speaker or a Korean speaker or a Mandarin speaker or Cantonese speaker or Japanese speaker or Vietnamese speakers. So although I cannot fully communicate with a Vietnamese speaker, I can communicate to an extent by writing in Chinese characters, because many of the characters, around 1,000 plus, the meaning of these characters remain consistent across language borders, and these are 1,000 everyday characters, not learned characters. It's like numbers 1, 2, and 3. Other characters might be the character that indicates above or top. So you have a suffix and you have 2 strokes above, which means that this is a character that symbolizes above or top. This is below because you have a suffix and 2 strokes below the suffix, means below or bottom. This means middle because you have an object and you have a stroke down the middle of the object. So it means middle or center kingdom, meaning China. And this is small because you have the body and you've got the 2 arms that are very, very adjacent to the body, meaning small. This would be the character for big because the arms are outstretched, as are the legs. And then this is the character for rice paddy because it's kind of what a rice paddy looks like. It's all divided. This is the character for power because it looks like a plow, you know. This is the character for woman because you've got the head and the shoulders and the arms and the body and the legs. This is the character for child because it's the fetal position, you know, and a few other examples of combination characters. So if you add rice paddy with the character power, you get the character for man. So the cultural assumption here is that a man is somebody who goes out to the rice paddy to work. So this is a woman, and you add the character for child, and you get the character to, well, you get the verb to like, because the assumption is that women like children. And then there's the woman, and you have another woman, and another woman, 3 women, and what do you get? You get the verb adultery because, again, from which you can see the culture from which this character emerged. I mean, it doesn't just mean adultery. All these characters have multiple meanings. One of them is adultery. So this is how ideographic writing systems work. We don't have to know the sound because the visuality creates the meaning which carries over to other linguistic spoken categories. So this is the Heart Sutra, the first line in orange. The Heart Sutra, translated into English, would be the Buddha of compassion when he meditated. There's a typo there, when he meditated. In Korean, the same text would be read or recited as 관자 제 보살 행심 반야 바라 밀 타시. But if a Chinese monk were to recite it, it would sound very differently, and again, when a Japanese monk recites it, it doesn't matter because it means the same thing. So all these texts, when seen through the European convention that speech and writing are conflated and their national categories are lost and distorted. And in Western linguistics, European linguistics, for 30 years, there was a long and rather bitter debate about whether there could be other writing systems that's not alphabetic, or whether there could be independent writing systems separate from speech. And of course, this is a question of degrees. It can never be completely separate. But recent developments, the last 20 years in the cognitive neuroscience of reading, has informed this debate to a great extent, because now there's a great deal of really magnificent work by people like Stanislas Dehaene, who've worked on the neural basis of literacy and different kinds of visual systems, writing systems, and the visuality, the encoding of that in the brain, that we are now in a position to be able to make distinctions between different kinds of scripts and the cognitive affordance of these different writing systems, and that we can actually differentiate between the sound pathway and the visual pathway, which are used in parallel and in combination when we actually read. So reading ideographic languages will be very different from reading a completely phonetic language, because the cognitive affordance of visuality is very different. And these are wonderful things to discover and to make sense of when we are reading literatures of the world, rather than reading it through the narrow prism of alphabetic languages. So this is another example about the visuality of writing. When you look at this picture, it might look like it's just Chinese writing. But when you look very, very closely, this is in fact a stanza from W.H. Auden's Leap Before You Look, written in what Zhu Bing calls English square calligraphy, where he compacts the linear writing into these freestanding symbols. And I'll just read it so that you can read it with me. So if you read the text downwards, starting from the left top, the first character is very easy to read, A, solitude. And if you look at it, you have the solitude. I hope you can figure it out. A solitude 10, T-E-N, 1,000 fathoms deep. Second line, sustains the bed on which we lie, my dear. Third line, although I love you, you will have to leap. Last line, our dream of safety has to disappear. Now, from this, you can see what a huge impact the visuality of writing makes on the reader, which is something that most writers from outside of Europe have known and have played with and have created with. A lot of literary technique has to do with the visuality of writing, as well, and in association with calligraphy, different types of calligraphy, but which is completely erased if you look at the literatures of the world through the prism of national language, national categories. Language and the speech are the same as written language. This is another example from by Zhu Bing, is the banner Art for the People. This is a banner which hung outside MoMA in New York for a while. And so my point is, the point that I would like to end with is that unless we bring into view the history of writing systems in world literature, what we call minor cultures, i.e. non-European cultures, will never be recognized as having a tradition of their own. Because minor cultures are disconnected from the historical past if we look at the history of writing through the prism of alphabetic writing. So, for example, when we read English literature, contemporary English literature. So let's say we are reading a poem by Seamus Heaney. You know, you can't really read Heaney without seeing Keats in his poetry, and you can't really read Keats on you know, without seeing an aspect of Milton there, and you can't really read Milton without seeing Shakespeare. And so when we read English literature, we kind of read and hear all the cadences of the tradition in that, you know, in that writing system, which is the alphabet. But when we impose these systems, this frame to other traditions around the world, that tradition gets distorted so that it becomes disfigured, and it only looks very derivative of Eurocentric norms. It's what happens to the English translation of Kwon Yo-sun's Spring Night. It's so distorted that it ceases to be what it was in its original language. And so in order to talk about world literature and diversity, I think it would be very exciting to really broaden our view to all the traditions that have existed around the world, that have their own writing systems and their own lineage, and not try and impose the European frame onto these other traditions, which renders them invisible and derivative and inferior. So this is the point that I would like to make. The idea that world literature is a collection of the best that's been thought and said, but if we are really going to read the best, we have to open our view to why they would be best in that particular time and place, and to apply those standards to the reading of those texts, rather than read them from a different standard, which is the global norm. That's translatability into it. That is the translatability into English. So I will stop here. Thank you very much. And I look forward to discussing some aspects of this lecture with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sowon. I thought that was absolutely gripping. There are 40 or 50 people out there who I think are clapping at this very moment. We'll have to imagine them, I think, through the iconographic grapheme of my clapping hands. I'm sure there will be lots of questions. I've got about 14 noted down on my little pad in front of me. But I wondered if we might just pause for perhaps 3 or 4 minutes. My clock here says 6:05, just in case there may be people out there who would appreciate a very brief break. In the meantime, those who have questions can, of course, put them onto obviously the question and answer button and the tab, which should be available to you on your screens now. So if we break now for perhaps 3 or 4 minutes until about 13 or 14 minutes past 6. Okay, hello, Sowon. So welcome back. I've already got a couple of questions. Now, what we're going to do with the questions this evening is, if you wish, you can ask to speak your questions live. Otherwise, and probably as a rule, we thought it would be a good idea if I simply read your questions from the list in front of me, which is now rapidly growing. But if you would like to engage in live dialogue, do say, and we'll arrange for Ronan to get you to appear on screen. So let's, Sowon, if we may, launch into the first question, which is a written one. The listener hasn't given her or his name, but let me read it out to you now. It's just 3 lines. This is a very simple question, but I was wondering, from Dr. Park's example with K-pop, could music also be considered part of the literature, or maybe a literature in itself, like poetry is?
So I'll answer very briefly that this is a very interesting question that I'm not really qualified to answer. But I think that if you look at the diverse literatures of the world, especially in where the tradition was oral, music has been so integrated with language that it'd be very difficult to separate the two. So I would say that that is a very, very important part of the tradition in many, many cultures, but not necessarily in the idea of literature as is currently understood in the global market.
Okay. If the questioner wants to come back on that, then by all means, fire away a riposte. I've got another question now from another listener who doesn't give her or his name. This is rather longer now. And the question is, quote, "I wonder what conceptions of world literature Professor Park is critiquing. Can she offer specific names of critics? For example, Casanova, or Moretti, Franco Moretti, or Damrosch, with whom she's in dialogue or critical of? The field of world literary studies has developed enormously over the past few years, and there's a very sophisticated understanding of the role of translation and cultural difference that is questioning the very notion of national literature, that seems to go unquestioned in this talk. Indeed, it's presented in very essentialist terms. In particular, the work of Francesca Orsini and her world literature prospect has done much in present world literature as a perspectival field. That's perspectival in quotes. There's a Chinese world literature, Soviet world literature, Indian world literature. It'd be great to hear more about what is meant here by, quote, the global novel, unquote, and who are its practitioners. And a basic question is, we're getting rather a lot of questions here. A basic question is, how do we know who a writer is writing for? Isn't this pretty unknowable?
Okay, so I will start with the critics who have informed my work. I didn't go into all these names. I've already kind of done that in my Oxford bibliographies, and I didn't want to kind of name check all these people again, but my thinking's been profoundly influenced by the work by Sheldon Pollock on script, Francesca Orsini, and Robert Young, and their work on what a language is and how European that particular conception is. Robert Young's article in the PMLA called "That Which We Call a Language" is a wonderful piece of essay which really charts this brilliantly. I am slightly critical of writers who've been influenced by the world systems theory, by Wallerstein. So you have the system of the center and the periphery, the major minor, this kind of division, because a lot of these critics use this system theory to critique the hierarchy of global literatures, but quite a lot of them end up reinforcing the very thing that they are critiquing, because what is it to call a literature minor? It's to minoritize it. It's to kind of confer that there's something already minor in it in order to critique that this is within a system theory. So I am very critical of this world system theory, because it really takes away the cultural agency of the local cultures that they're trying to champion. So that, this is part of the talk that, part of thinking that informs my talk. And then, oh yes, how do we know who are writers writing for? Well, I mean, of course, when you write, you're not really thinking of any one person. It's very rare you do that, but you do have a reader in mind. This came home to me when I was doing the recording for the lecture. I did it on my own. I just couldn't get the words out because, it was the blank. So if you look at, say, the Rosetta Stone, one of the earliest inscriptions, you can see it's in 3 scripts. And from that, we can infer that it was addressed to the ruling elite. There's the Greek, and then there's the Demotic for the ordinary people. And so from the choice of script, you can actually deduce the sociolinguistic community that the text is addressing. Now, this is not possible in the globalized age of English, because that's an anonymous language. It's kind of the lingua franca now. And so when you write in English, it's pretty unknowable. But when you look at the choice of script, then it becomes much easier to see where that particular text is situated. So.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that. Again, please feel free to respond to this, and with a bit of luck, we'll get back to it. I've now got a question from Laszlo Polosz, who is one of my colleagues as a director of the IAS, and here goes, quoting: "Even in Europe, we have the Greek, the Cyrillic alphabets, as well as the runes in many cultures. Records of the Semitic languages like Arabic or Hebrew are not quite European either, and their development is not really a result of imperialistic tendencies. Would you care to comment on these?" Unquote.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So digraphia has existed in Europe and continues to exist. So if you think about Serbia or Azerbaijan, they use multiple scripts, which can be synchronous or it can be just historical, sequential. And the idea that there is a language for a nation is kind of a 19th century convention, but that is the standard that's been taught at schools. So the kind of interlingual mixing that we saw in K-pop, that kind of energetic kind of conviviality of languages, we see a lot in rap in Europe, in fact, as well as all the other forms of popular culture. It is a very, very kind of grounded, grassroots up kind of form of expression, because it's just full of the kind of exuberant vitality that people enjoy when they communicate. And by mixing the language, when you see mixed scripts or mixed forms, you can then infer who the community is and where that was situated. So I think that by associating a language to express a certain nationality, i.e. when we talk about the Russian novel, the English novel, it erases and conceals all the very complex relations that people have always had and always will with regards to communication and speech.
Okay, thanks very much. Here's a question, Sowon, which I've fished out of the chat, actually, rather than the Q&A. And it's from someone called Veronica Strang. And it says, thanks for a wonderful lecture, Sowon. As an anthropologist, my most obvious question is whether there's scope for interdisciplinary partnerships between my own discipline in specializing cultural translation and language translators to assist in deepening the nuance of translation. A broader question would be about mapping. I work with Aboriginal Australians whose traditions do not include written languages, but instead focus on visual material that is multivalent and which communicates in very sophisticated ways ideographically. The history of maps could be compared here in that early maps around the world were more ideographic and have experienced a similar process of homogenization with the imposition of generic cartographic traditions. Could your analysis be applied similarly to cartography?
That would be a fascinating study that I would learn a great deal from. I mean, it's not something that I feel I could comment on myself, but maybe I can just touch upon one idea, which is a very dominant idea, that if you look at the history of how languages and writing systems evolved, writing is very, very recent in evolutionary history. It's about 5,000 years old. You know, the alphabet is about 3,000 years old. So it's very recent. And cognitive neuroscience is very, very helpful in understanding how these writing systems came about, because even if we're comparing Chinese or the alphabet, they share certain design features of the human visual system that writing systems, well, we didn't evolve to create writing. It's rather writing systems evolved within the genetic constraints of our visual system. And therefore, knowing about the similar design features and how it is that we as humans can have a visual representation which is aligned to speech is something very, very interesting to know about. It's interesting because it really debunks the idea that writing systems evolve to become the alphabet. This was thought for 30 years in Western linguistics, that ideographic writings were like precursors of the alphabet and they would evolve to become the rational system that is the alphabet, which is not true at all. Because visual communication is a lot faster than the phonological route. The straight lexical route is a lot quicker than the phonological route, when you have to switch the sign for the sound and then understand the content. And this is demonstrated actually on the internet through lots of emojis, emoji fiction, and so on and so forth, how we do in fact communicate visually without going through sound. And that is an independent form of communication that's on the rise, not declining. But that's just another side comment to the very interesting question that was raised, which I'm not equipped to answer.
Thanks very much, Sowon, for that. I'm still holding my breath here because I have numbers of questions as well. But let me just interleave another comment before we move on to the next question so you can catch your breath. Someone writes, this was absolutely incredible. I don't know what I expected coming here tonight, but it wasn't this, and I loved it. Thank you. I'm so disappointed that I have to leave now, but thank you, inspiring. And on that note, let's turn to the next question in my list, which is a digital shift. Thank you for such a wonderful and well-explained lecture. Do you have any thoughts on how the internet has affected world literature? Personally, I've noticed that fan translations, particularly of anime or K-dramas, Chinese webcomics, and so on and so forth, often try to account for cultural differences by using mostly literal translations in the subtitles, with translator notes for context on the side. Whereas official translations, by contrast to the fan translations then, tend to go for more universal, less nuanced subtitles that are more widely understood.
Thank you for this. So this kind of touches upon the comment that I made with reference to Veronica's question about how technology can decimate languages around the world, and it is doing that with reference to English. But there are more kind of fan group related re-emergence of what's called minor languages. Korean is one of them, or Japanese anime, graphic fiction is another, where young readers around the world are communicating in foreign languages that they've acquired through fan translations and so on and so forth, which again, I think goes some way to solidify my idea that outside of the standardized educational structure where you have monolingualism and a history of literature written in that mono language, the way people like to live, the way they like to communicate is a lot more complex than that. And this is a spontaneous splurge of interlingual mixing that you see on fan sites and fan fictions and fan translations. So I think that there are two rather opposite things going on, which is very, very positive, that it isn't just the one. There's a lot of reaction against this as well.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Have we got time for a few more, Sowon?
Yes.
Yes, they're still rolling in, I'm afraid. And I'm hoping that I've got room for one at the end. Okay, here's the next one. Again, from someone who hasn't left a name. Do you think that written language could also clash with oral traditions in a negative culture erasing way, such as ballads and epics that have been transcribed when they were previously related orally?
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's not just the potentiality. Historically, this has proven to be the case. Many people have written about this already, the relations between how textuality has wiped clean kind of orality. But again, I would like to think slightly positively how the digital community is reviving certain pockets of orality that was kind of wiped out through the dominant tradition of the written book. So here, of course, it could go both ways, but it's not just kind of a one-directional kind of top-down multinational corporate culture that exists. There are other things that are going on as well. Thank you for that.
Okay, yeah, I should say, because the question came in a second time, this was from Nicoletta Raumann. Thank you, Nicoletta, for that as well. Okay, it looks as if there is another question on the way. Let's see if I can get this to emerge on my own screen. Yeah, it isn't coming through quite yet on my screen, but
I have it on mine. Shall I read it?
Sure. Yes. No, I've got it now, Ronan. Ronan, thank you. Yes, it's from my colleague Rob Barton. Here we go. Here's Rob's question: to what extent is the critique of identifying a language with a nation actually just as much a critique of the idea of the nation, which is really just a politico-economic abstraction? I guess there are two essentialisms occurring here: a language and a nation. Perhaps this confluence creates a sort of multiplex essentialism, for example, Russian literature.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. I love the phrase multiplex essentialism. You've said it so much better than I did. But this is exactly my point, that if you think of world literature in this kind of multiplex essentialist way, it doesn't go very far toward diversity at all. It's just packaged as such, which really conceals a lot more, distorts and conceals a lot more than it seems to. Thank you for that.
Okay, I think there's a genuine pause now. Maybe just a quickie from me, if I may, but please, I think we probably have a few minutes more if anyone else wants to write in or indeed wants to talk. I had a question willy-nilly from a German perspective. A little bit before Engels and Marx, there was another concept of world literature, Sowon, which you may or may not know, but you could be forgiven for not knowing it. Which is by Goethe, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Mm-hmm. And he, at least in European literary circles, is often thought of as one of the originators of the concept of world as opposed to national literature. And the credit that Goethe gets for this is his notion of a new canon of world literature based on a new quality of world literature. The credit being due for the fact that Goethe is wholly non-Eurocentric in his notion of the quality of world literature. And he attempted to prove that by translating the Persian poet Hafiz in his West-Eastern Divan, the Westöstlicher Divan, which are most wonderful translations, at least in German. He used the linguistic work of the German Romantics to do that. So we have a totally decentered canon of world literature there. How do we deal with this Goethean question of quality and canon, as opposed to simply intercultural exchange of values?
Mm. Yeah, thank you for that. I resisted quoting Goethe as well as the kind of the modern trinity of Casanova, Moretti, and Damrosch, because most world literature talks do that, and I thought people might get bored. But that, you know, your point is so interesting, which I'm not going to be able to answer satisfactorily. But world literature as a concept is used in two opposite ways at the moment. One is the idea that it's something, as you said, which is beyond the nation and the national language. It's something very universal. On the other hand, it's like a UN structure where how many Nobel Prizes has this kind of tradition won? So it's a total hierarchy and ranking system of the nationalities. And there, because it's so tied to the political economy of that state, it's always packaged up into these nation states. And they're used, today, it's used at the same time in two rather opposite ways. So, yeah, so that's my answer. Just
that's a good answer. Yeah,
contradiction.
Okay, now, I have to say, as far as I can tell, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ronan, as our chief technician here, I don't think there are any other questions. No one has come back on your answers either. So did you want to say anything else before I move to close proceedings?
No, but just to say thank you for giving me the opportunity to share my work with you. I did find the recording immensely difficult, so I do apologize for the dithering, but there it is. Under COVID circumstances, I am delighted that I could share my work with you. Thank you.
It was definitely a communicative event, so thank you so much for that. I've got nothing but delighted comments here from the 40 or 50 people out there. So I think you can be very satisfied with what's gone on this evening. There will, of course, in the nature of these things, discourse generates more discourse. There will be more questions and more comments. Be assured, viewers and listeners, that a recording of this event will be posted by Ronan very soon on the IAS website. And of course, there will be a blog where you can continue the discussion with Sowon herself. I'd like to thank Ronan also for having given us such good technical support. And let me leave just with an advert for our next event, which is by one of our resident artists, Sarah Danais, and it is a lecture, the next in this series, entitled, I'll just give you the short version of the title, Apollo Lies Weeping. Very intriguing title. That's at 5:30 on the 25th of November. And with that, thanks to you again, Sowon. Thanks to our loyal listeners and viewers as well. And good night.